The opinions expressed are those of the host and guests of this program and are not necessarily those of station staff, management, or sponsors. WPSL does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WPSL. It's time to Ask a Rabbi. Call in with your questions and comments at 340-1590. And now, here's your host, Rabbi Shafir Lobb.
Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Shafir Lobb. Ooh, let me move this around so you can see me again. The joys of trying to get all the associated pieces in place. So welcome to Ask a Rabbi. As always, I invite you to give me a call at 772-340-1590. And I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have that might cross a rabbi's eyes or ears or anything like that. So we start out with an interesting time this week. It is the Torah portion called Mishpatim, or Judgments, and it follows getting the 10 Commandments or the 10 utterances. And I'm always amused at how people translate the 10 Commandments, because that's one of those wonderful translation things. It's not quite what the Hebrew says, but there's many like that. So one of my favorite ones in there is, "Thou shalt not lie." That's not at all what it says. It doesn't say anything about lying. It talks about don't afflict your neighbor with false witness. That's a totally different thing, right? And I always like to point out to people that God lies. God lies in the story of the angels visiting Abraham and Sarah to tell them that Sarah is going to have a child in a year or so. Sarah laughs when she hears this. She's sitting in the tent behind them, and she hears that she's going to have a child, and she starts laughing at the idea. And when the angel challenges her and says, why are you, or God challenges her and says, why are you laughing? She says, he's an old man. How can he do that?
Okay.
Right? And then later, God is talking to Abraham and says, Sarah laughed. She laughed because she's an old woman, and it's really hard to give an old woman an orgasm. Okay. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge difference, but it really is, right? Because if God had come to Abraham and said, Sarah says you're an old man and you can't do this,
he might believe that.
Well, he might believe it. He might also get angry.
Okay.
Right? It doesn't create shalom bayit. It doesn't create peace in the house. It might be true, but it's what we call brutal truth. It's not helpful. It's not constructive.
Mm-hmm.
And so God doesn't report exactly what Sarah says. He kind of gives the gist, but he does it in a way that, in fact, hooks Abraham's ego. So he's kind of got to perform.
Okay.
Right?
But see, now without the little lie, maybe he wouldn't have even tried.
Right, exactly. And that's the point.
And that wasn't the outcome that needed to happen.
That isn't exactly. And
Okay.
so God plays with the details,
Okay.
right? Because he knows that already she's skeptical. And so, he's going to stack the deck, if you will, in the other direction. And so the commandment is not anything about lying. There's nothing wrong with lying as long as nobody's hurt, right? So in God's lies, nobody's hurt. In fact, it facilitates the situation. And so it's not false. Don't afflict your neighbor with false witness. And don't hurt somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Don't say something that's going to hurt somebody.
Yeah, it's almost like the same thing. Does this dress make me look fat? And your husband goes, no, it's beautiful.
Well, yeah.
It's not the dress.
Yeah, you're right.
But the truth might hurt.
Well, and okay, so let's look at that one. If you really love your partner,
don't wear that dress.
Well, you might say don't wear that dress, or that might not be your most flattering. But to your partner, you still do look beautiful.
Okay.
Right? Because
yeah.
Right. Love is not seeing the stark physical reality. Love is seeing the love, and that is beautiful. So it's again right. There's multiple parts to it. May that that dress might not be the best choice. That suit, whatever, might not be the best choice to flatter that body, That's not what the question was asked,
Mm-hmm.
right? And those are difficult questions, and what can I say? That's a matter of communication. And communication is actually the biggest reason for couples to break down. There's not good communication. Okay, so another one of those wonderful 10 commandments that isn't what is usually translated. It's often translated as thou shalt not kill. That's not what it says. It says thou shalt not murder. There's a huge difference between killing and murdering, and that in fact is where the next section starts out. It starts out by saying, what is murder? Right? What is it that you're not supposed to do? And unfortunately, Stuart left, so we don't have the lawyer's little discussion here. But it then goes on and continues to discuss, lying in wait and versus if the axe flies off your handle and strikes somebody. And then it even goes into more detail and says if they lay in their bed 3 days and linger, then you are not liable for murder. So, so you've got two things that have to happen for murder. Is one, the person has to die pretty quickly, within 3 days, and it has to be intent, lying in wait. So that's pretty interesting. And it doesn't matter if you use an agent or do it yourself, you're still liable.
Now, what happens if you plot and plan this end of someone's life and then they linger?
Well, then it's attempted murder.
Okay.
Right? It's not murder. It's still assault and it's still an attack.
Right.
But it's not murder.
Okay.
Right. And the same thing's true in American law. If you go out to try to kill somebody and you aren't successful, then you're not guilty of murder. You're guilty of attempted murder. It's a different issue. And the same is true in scriptures. So and there's different things, and we also get an idea that's really an undercurrent, but you need to bring it out, which is it talks about, in the case of homicide, how to not murder, homicide, in manslaughter rather, right? In cases of manslaughter, so the axe flies off your handle and
it's an accident. You never intended.
You never intended to do anything, but the person's dead, and it talks in that case about the protections that are offered to the person from the relatives or the blood, the blood accounting that some relative might want to do. And in fact, that's where it comes into this famous part that's always abused, which is, right, a life for a life, a wound for a wound, a tooth for a tooth. And that's not about running around and punching everybody's eyes out and punching everybody's tooth out. It's actually more toward that bounty collector who's trying to, avenge the family's perceived loss, right? Blaming the guy whose axe fell off and killing them because, he accidentally killed somebody. And they're saying, no, you don't do that. You limit the damages. You don't continue to escalate. Let's say the axe flies off the handle. It doesn't kill somebody, but it cuts off his hand and he can no longer work. Well, then the damages are limited. It doesn't mean you run over and you chop off the hand of the guy who did it, but in fact, he's financially liable for the value of what was lost. So it's the beginning of tort law, what we call tort law, and so there's a limitation on that, and so otherwise we would have a whole bunch of people who were running around and were blind and toothless, and it wouldn't be very good at all. Okay, and I understand that we have Bob on line 1 from Port St. Lucie. Hi, Bob. Thanks for calling.
Yes, hi, Rabbi. Talking about, just what is murder in the eyes of Scripture, what about abortion? Is that considered murder, or?
Actually, no, it's not. It talks about if two men struggle and they accidentally hit a woman and she miscarries. So that's not even abortion. There's a damage due, but it's not murder.
Okay.
So in scriptures, life doesn't begin until the child is born.
Okay.
And takes its first breath.
Okay.
Right? It has to be breathed to life, to breathing air. So that's a little bit of a difference.
Okay.
So that doesn't even ask the question of whether or not the fetus is viable if it's not born.
Because in my faith, life begins at the point of conception.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that.
Yeah.
And actually, the scriptures goes a little bit further, and it says that if the child is endangering the mother, then it is a rodef, a stalker. And a stalker is somebody who can be killed, actually.
Self-defense.
Right. And there's a specific, a rodef, a stalker, a pursuer, somebody who's really coming out to get you. And if that judgment can be made, then scriptures would say that, you don't get to harm somebody else, and that includes your mother. You don't get to harm your mother. And then, of course, you get into the discussion of what's harm and what's not harm. It's not an easy, as I like to say very often when I'm getting into some of the details, there are not easy answers. There are truly interesting questions. And ethics, bioethics, is a very deep follow-on to, how do we use these rules? It's the next step after this Torah portion, after this week's reading, which starts to talk about what is murder. And no, you can't pin that one in early scriptures.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, you're dealing with a definition that goes beyond scriptures, and that's if that's part of your faith, it's part of your faith.
Right.
So no argument there, but it's not in scriptures.
We could go into whether or not I argue or not. I've argued before with people with people in my own church.
I understand. And it's a hard thing to ask, although I will tell you that between 40 and 50% of all fertilized eggs never result in a full pregnancy. The body often sloughs them off within the first 2 weeks.
Okay.
So, is nature murdering? No. We can take it to extremes if we choose to. Because less than, about half will actually impregnate, and not all of those will carry to term either. And I love getting into some of these discussions because you can really get into the what ifs. Right.
Well, that's sort of the science behind it.
Whoops. Sorry about that, folks watching on Facebook. That was an unintentional little ride on the roller coaster. But well, those are questions in Scripture. Scripture very often doesn't get super specific about things. And so it does leave room for interpretation. But birth starts or rather life starts at birth in Scriptures.
Okay.
In fact, in some cases, one could even argue that maybe even a little bit later, Abraham doesn't celebrate Isaac, his son, until he's weaned. And part of the reason for that probably is the large number of infant mortality in those days. Right?
Okay.
That not only is it a question of whether or not the fetus is viable, but is the baby viable? Right. So he doesn't even count him as a son until he's weaned, which might make us wonder how many Sarah had that didn't make it there. We don't know.
Yeah.
Right, because barren doesn't necessarily mean you haven't birthed. It just means you don't have living children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a different time, right? We look today, and it's really easy with our high birth rate to think that, they had the same numbers. But it really isn't even that long ago that we had more babies die than lived. This is a recent phenomena, and we're dealing with a whole different scenario. We didn't even name a child until after it was born, and now people are naming the kid way early. And at the ultrasound, they do a reveal party. You didn't know the sex of your child until it came out.
Right.
So lots of things are changing with our technology. So yeah, and
I know in my case, my dad had his first initial was R, and he wanted the R, but he didn't want me named after him.
Okay.
So he wanted me called by another name. But when I was born, they thought I was going to die, so my mom said, this kid is at least going to die with a name. Mm-hmm. And the priest who baptized me thought that
he did want it.
The day was the feast of the apparently my patron saint.
Okay.
And so they said, okay, we'll middle name him what you want, what we wanted to name him, and then his first name will be Robert.
Okay. So that's how you got the name Robert.
That's how I got the name Robert.
Okay. So, yeah, different families have different traditions.
Right, different strokes for different folks.
Right, yeah. And Jacob, of course, renames Benjamin, the second child of Rachel. She dies in childbirth. She doesn't name him, she names him Affliction. I can understand Jacob renaming him after she passes, but yeah.
Flicky!
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of folks with that name. Those are the children of Naomi, that Ruth's husband, and Naomi's two sons are sickly and weakly. So yeah, probably not their real names, right? Right. But that's one of the joys of literature, right? Because the Book of Ruth is Jewishly a literature story. It's a story. It's not held at the same level as Torah or prophets. It's at a lower level. It's a sacred story, but it's a story.
Okay.
So, yeah. And, if you read through the lines, you understand that has to happen because apparently David looks like a Moabite. And how can a Moabite be the king of Israel? So you have to have a plausible explanation of how somebody could look like a Moabite but not be. And the key to that is in the tail end of the book of Ruth. When Ruth gives birth to her son, Naomi holds it up and says, "This is my son," because she's lost her two sons. So Ruth's first child is not Ruth's; it's Naomi's. That's Levirate marriage. And if you understand Levirate marriage, you get it. And the point of that is that, the kid can look like a Moabite and not be allowed into the community as a Moabite, but because it's Naomi's child, then it is not a Moabite child, even if genetically it is. Scriptures doesn't care about the genetics anywhere near as much as it cares about a lot of other things. And adoption is very frequently occurring. Another famous adoption that a lot of people miss is the one of when Jacob is on his deathbed and Joseph comes to him with his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Then Jacob actually adopts them. Now that's an easy way to give Joseph a double cut of the inheritance, because if he adopts two of his sons, then they each get one cut of the inheritance. So it's a de facto way of giving Joseph's kids what Joseph would have gotten had he been a firstborn. But of course he's not. He's a firstborn of his mother, but not of his father. Okay. So yeah, so that's an interesting piece, and that's part of why if you look at a display of the tribes, Joseph is usually with a divided line, and it shows the two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they get a huge amount of land. They're cattlemen, so they need a good amount of land so that they don't overgraze. There's lots of practical things in the story. And so you've got this weaving of story and some details that seem to be reasonably factual and make a lot of sense within the time. So I hope I answered your question about babies.
Yes, you did. Thanks much.
Okay. Take care, Bob. Thank
bye-bye.
you so much for calling. And I certainly welcome any other calls that we might have at 772-340-1590. So the question that Bob had asked, is for those who didn't hear the question, was what does the Bible view abortion? And it recognizes that the woman loses her fruit, but it doesn't view it as murder. It's not listed as a murder. You have to be alive, and to scriptures, you're not alive until after you take a breath. So that gives part of the piece of it. And what can I say to that? That's what scriptures looks at things a little bit differently than we do.
But you have to wonder that they didn't really deal with that situation, because this is the termination of a pregnancy by the mother, and probably that, although that has gone on for a long time prior to our modern technology, but why would scriptures even look at that?
When it looks at it, it's looking at it as two people fighting, and the woman is somehow involved in the fight, and so she gets punched in the belly, and that causes the miscarriage. I'm reasonably sure that they had a morning after potion of some sort if the pregnancy was not desired. And how far along into term that would work, who knows. My own mother said to me that if she had wanted to miscarry me, all she had to do was do some exercises, because she had lost other children by being active. And so she took to bed rest in order to not lose me. Would she be liable? I don't think so. Right. Yeah. And I'm sure there were other ways to induce, and I'm sure that, whatever works as a coat hanger has been well known for a long time. It's not new. So, yeah. There's a lot more to it. The only child that we hear about dying in scriptures is David's love child with Bathsheba, the one that he fertilizes while she's still married to Uriah before he's murdered. And, you want to talk about a really messy situation. It's, killing somebody's husband and then marrying her, right, which is a legal marriage because she's now a widow. But, yeah.
But, you have to go back to the whole murder thing.
Yeah. Right. And that's a subtle murder, right? But it's definitely, the prophet Nathan, who comes and chastises David for it, clearly knows that, that's a murder. You did it. You sent him into battle, into an impossible situation, and you told Joab to pull back and let him fall. Hello. Yeah. One of the most famous ways that people accidentally get murdered, and is people that are left to in bad situations. So what can I say to all of that? There's lots of interesting little pieces in Scripture that you can dig into and have lots of fun. So we just really touched on a couple of the things that are in the 10 Commandments, or 10 utterances, right? On the other hand, if you kidnap somebody, whether you sold him or still have him, that's the death penalty. That's a capital crime. So they looked very seriously at a number of things that today we still look at. It took a long time for kidnapping to become a capital crime. In the U.S., it wasn't originally. So they didn't totally follow scriptures. What can I say? So life starts in the Bible with birth, and we have one baby whose death is recorded, and after that, we continue on. It's a political story. And we have John in Stewart on line 1. Thank you for calling, John.
I've heard part of your discussion. I haven't heard all of it. But if life begins at the first breath, when is the soul infused into life?
Scripturally, at that point.
What scripture are you quoting where the soul is infused into the baby?
In the first 5 books.
Well, that covers a lot of territory. Can you
I'd
give me
have
a
to look.
verse?
I'd have to. No, I have to look that up. I don't.
Yeah.
I
The other
can.
question is, what do you think about this? The new laws that's been passed in New York and is being discussed in Virginia, where the baby is physically delivered, takes a breath, is checked out, made sure it's viable, and then they kill it. Would you consider that killing? Thou shalt not kill.
If it's born and takes a breath and
Yes, there's the law was just changed in New York. It allows the baby to be killed after it's delivered.
I'm
Same
not.
thing,
How far along?
It's being discussed in Virginia too. At the time of delivery.
Okay, so you're saying it takes a breath. Now,
Yeah, it takes a breath and is considered viable.
There's some sort of time
and
frame
then
too, where
the doctor and the mother can decide whether they want to kill the baby or not. I
or
consider
revive
it
it.
infanticide. Yeah.
Yeah.
That would
Okay.
be considered infanticide as far as I'm concerned. But
I'm
maybe
not. I have to tell you that I'm not familiar enough with that law.
Well, it was
Yeah,
just
there's
like
two
this
states
week.
Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's for real. The New York law has already been passed.
How far along in the pregnancy?
Delivered.
Well, no, I
Delivered.
understand, but is it 24 weeks? Is it 38 weeks?
No, full term.
Full term.
Full term.
Full term.
9 months. Full term. Full term delivered baby.
And the mother can ask the doctor to revive the baby within a certain amount of time or something.
No, it's not revived. The baby is delivered and breathes and is viable, and then the decision is made whether to keep the baby or not. And then the baby is basically killed after the fact, after the delivery.
Okay, I will. What I'm going to have to say to that, John, is that I'm going to have to look at that piece of legislation, and I'll do that over the week, and I'll come back with it next week.
Yeah, it's
Sure.
New York and
Also,
Virginia.
I'd like to know where when the soul is infused into the baby. Of course, it's a baby as soon as it's.
It's a baby as soon as it's
conceived,
born.
It's not a mass of cells. Other than it's going to be a human person once it's conceived. It's not going to be anything else. But anyway, a very interesting discussion. I appreciate your input, and I thank you.
Okay. Thank you for calling, John.
Okay,
So yeah,
And the new legislation it's like they're looking back now at say women who were killed while carrying, and people were charged with the murder of the mother and the baby.
Yeah.
And now they're going back and going, well, if you're saying that it's not really a baby, these people were put in jail for two people. And it's
laws,
really a mess.
Oh, I don't doubt that it's a mess, and that's why I'm saying I don't want to pass judgment on something.
Yeah, and this was
about
all,
which I don't
all
know
just
enough.
in the news just this
Okay,
week. Yeah.
so I missed that that one item, and I certainly did not look at the details on it. So I will do that homework. I will be much more intelligent about it. Maybe Stuart and I will talk about doing a combined session on that topic. That would probably be an interesting one. We'll look at the different, because it's up to states to define a lot of different things. States, in fact, in some cases, define what's murder and what's manslaughter and what's aggravated, what's all kinds of things. You get into all levels of detail. And I don't even begin to want to get into the mind of all of the legislators and all of the things that they're thinking about.
Well, I think this is in preparation because they're in such fear of the Supreme Court overturning
Roe
v.
versus
Wade. Mhm.
Okay, so again, I will look it up. I don't know enough to, and it's one of the things that hopefully you'll get out. You'll get my mouth to work. That you'll see with me is that if I don't know something, I will tell you. I do not know enough about the law in New York or in Virginia. I'd want to read the actual legislation, not just the articles about it.
Yeah, and what's hit the news? Yeah.
Well, because the news on any side is always slanted. What I tell you is slanted with what I
Sure.
what I perceive,
what you know and what
I
you
know,
believe. Yeah.
Right? Yeah, with all of that. So every source has got a bias, and that includes me. But I will look at that, and then we'll talk some more next week about abortion law and the Bible. That sounds like a good topic. Sounds like a fun one.
And I do think you'll get calls.
You think I'll get calls on
think so,
abortion
yeah.
and the Bible?
Yeah.
All right, so I will do my homework and look at some of that. And, yeah. All right, so back to the Ten Commandments. We've covered a good chunk of it. And for a lot of it, it doesn't even go into a lot of detail. So the standard joke is the law is given, right? The Ten Commandments, the 10 utterances. And the very next chapter in scriptures is this is how you understand those, because even in ancient days people got it that it doesn't do any good to give the words and then not tell you what it means. So what can I say? We've always been interpreting and trying to understand, and it's scripture, it's sacred story. There's lots of things in there that we don't follow at all. Like it says, don't eat fat. Yeah. Don't eat fat. A lot of people know that it says don't eat blood, and yet people still have blood sausage and things like that. So there's lots of pieces in here that are not followed. What can I say? Yes, and then there's one of my favorite ones that occurs 3 times. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's the one that one sentence repeated 3 times is the basis for the separation of meat and milk in Jewish tradition, Jewish law. And I don't know about you, but I don't run around boiling kids, and certainly not in their mother's milk. And so that's about goats or sheep. And it's not as much about cows. And it's certainly not about chickens, because I'd like to know who can boil a chicken in its mother's milk. Not too many chickens make milk. Flamingos make milk for their babies, which they then feed through their. That's really kind of cool to watch. They flip their heads, and the baby drinks it out of that beak, that big curved beak, and they do make a milk for their babies. But chickens don't do that. So you can't boil a chicken hamburger in its mother's milk. But there's lots of, people that separate chicken from milk, and it's all pinned on that one sentence. So there's lots of interpretation that occurs. But what can I say?
But is it like food safety from a long time ago?
I don't think the meat and milk one is. The story in Talmud where they're starting to discuss these rules. 2 of the rabbis are walking, and they're in the marketplace, and they overhear a woman talking about a recipe of boiling lamb in milk. And they become afraid that accidentally a woman could end up violating this requirement of don't see the kid in its mother's milk, because if you're on a farm, what milk are you going to get? What lamb are you going to get? The odds suddenly...
They come from the same source.
Right, they come from the same source, so suddenly the odds go way up that you could inadvertently, not intentionally, but you could inadvertently end up violating that rule. And so they start to say, well, what is meat? What is milk? How do we prevent this from being a possibility? And so they start banning all mammals from being boiled in milk. Now, fast forward, you go to a restaurant and they throw a pat of butter on a steak. Mm-hmm. Is that seething the kid in its mother's milk? Yeah, it starts to get harder to pin it down into that one sentence. Mm-hmm. How far do you carry the rule in order to make sure that something's safe? And there's not good answers on that one either. Somebody on Facebook here is saying Hillel believed the gist of Torah was do not do to others what is hateful to you, and the rest is commentary, and that's exactly right. And that does seem to be the overarching premise. When we look at those 10 commandments, again, those are not, if you covet your neighbor's stuff, who's going to know it? right? Coveting, being jealous of something. Yes, it's going to show in your behavior, but proving it? How do you prove a thought crime? Right. So clearly that's not a problem. The behavior that it generates is a problem, but you can't solve it in a court of man.
But yet, if you abide by that, you will feel better.
Absolutely. So these are, that's why I always say, I get a kick out of the church marquees that say, the one that I passed that one time that says, what are they, 10 guidelines? And I said, yeah, they kind of are, right? Because you can't take them into court. Now, God's court, that's a different story. God, you and God have a no lies kind of relationship. You can try to lie to God, but what you're really lying to is yourself. And so God's going to know, but that's not going to help the community. That's not going to help. But not doing it, hearing "don't do it," is more likely to let you say, well, maybe I am doing some things that aren't constructive. And the details on Hillel. Hillel lived. If Hillel and Shammai were real people, because it's really hard when you didn't have CNN and Fox News and anybody else to video it to know who's real and who's not. But there were two schools of thought that were around several hundred years before Jesus, the schools of Hillel and Shammai. Shammai, the name Shammai comes from the word name, and Shammai is always very meticulous about the letter of the law kind of thing, and following rituals to their extreme so that you're sure you do it right. He does a lot of discussion, for example, in the fall festival where the palm branches are carried. There's myrtle leaves that are part of that. It's the palm branch, a myrtle leaf, a willow leaf, and a citrine, a nice fruit. And that didn't come until the silk trade, when Oriental citrus came into the Middle East. But the myrtle, Shammai spends a lot of time talking about how the leaves should look and be opposed, and you should get just the right branches. And Hillel, his counterpart, and Hillel comes from the word meaning praise, more love-based, says if you can only get 2 of the 3 branches, then that you've satisfied the requirement. He always gives a cut to the break, a cut to the poor, rather, a break to the poor. And so he's much more interested in the spirit of the law. And we see that kind of division in all traditions, in all cultures. There are people who are, the line has to be right here and it can't be over 1 millimeter. Right? So very, very rigorous on the structure of things. And others who are, if your heart's in the right place, that's what counts. And Hillel was definitely much more your heart's in the right place. Now, it's worth noting, when we'll digress into this some other sessions. We'll also take a look at, in a funny kind of a way, a little bit of what kind of a world Jesus was operating in. So we'll go there. My specialty is first and second century Judea. And so one of the things that's worth noting is that Shammai, who's very much into the ritual and the letter of the law and the structure of the Matbea, he is stronger in the north, which is a wealthier, more fertile part of ancient Israel, Judea and the northern kingdom of Israel. And Hillel is much stronger in the south, where people are poorer. And so you have these two schools that are, what's really unique about them is that they can have what are called holy disagreements. They never are disrespectful of each other. They never go into ad hominems. They just don't go there. They don't get disrespectful, even when they disagree. And in general, Jewish law comes down on the side of Hillel, except for 3 times. So there's a cute little video that I actually show in my world religion class, which has Hillel and Shammai playing rock, scissors, paper, and it has a tally board on the chalkboard behind them. And by Hillel, it's got a couple hundred, and by Shammai, it's got 3. Which is kind of a pun toward that part of their discussion. But Yeah, Hillel always came down on the side of love and doing what what you can. And you're right, Al. There's a story about a conversion that goes along with his coming out with that statement. But it's thou shalt not do, don't do that which is hateful to you. Do not do to your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Go and study. That's Hillel's version of the Golden Rule, which is the Judaism's version of the Golden Rule, which also matches some other religions in the area. Christianity, of course, changes it to do unto others what you would have them do to you. Flips it to the other side. We can talk about that sometime too. Lots of different interesting subjects. All I need is a phone call to ask me, and you can do that by calling me at 772-340-1590. I'm going to digress just a moment and invite folks to come join us sometime on a Friday night at 7:30. Some of these things that I talk about here on the show, we talk about more at the service. That's our Friday night Kabbalat, or welcoming Shabbat. And that's at 7:30, and we are at 540 Northwest University Boulevard, Suite 102. And anyone is welcome to come to our service. They're open. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to even be Jewish. You're always welcome. Our doors are clearly open. We're a house of prayer for all people. And Saturday morning, we do Torah study. You can get into more of the discussion on the Torah portion and ask other kinds of questions, and that's at 9:30 on Friday, or Saturday rather, our Stolen Moments, and the service on Shabbat morning is at 10:30. So lots of different things going on that hopefully you can find something of interest. Please do join us. So coming back to scriptures, here's one that a lot of people, it doesn't really hold because we don't do slaughtering and sacrifices in the temple anymore, but it says, you don't offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, right? And don't leave the fat laying around. That's another interesting one, right? So you can't just throw stuff around. Was it health, you asked me, right? You asked that question. I think people are healthier not mixing meat and milk. I think people are healthier not eating pork, particularly if you can't guarantee that it's not infected pork and that it's well cooked. But the challenge with pork is always to make sure that it's cooked well enough to kill whatever might be in it. And that's another good reason for not eating the birds of prey and not eating the idea of vulture for dinner. Just that's not
no, it can't be good to eat something that eats dead things.
Yeah, and that retches and never mind. Yeah, all that good stuff. And it's not probably not good to eat the bottom feeders in the sea either. Certainly not. And what was clearly true is they didn't have refrigeration, right? Part of the reason that people can safely eat shrimp and lobster and other seafood is because when it's caught on the ship, it's then put in refrigeration right away on the ship. My mother used to say, well, you don't eat seafood in any month that doesn't have an R. Right? Some of our older listeners might remember that rule, right? So you don't eat from May. You don't eat seafood in May, June, July, and August. Why? Because it's so hot that the fish will rot before the ship gets back to sea. You can dry fish. You can lay fish out and it will dry and become like a jerky. You cannot do that with shrimp and lobster. It'll rot and get yucky. So do I think there's a health side to it? Yeah. Do I think it was about health? Not directly. On the other hand, right, it's really hard to be godly and do God's work when you're busy worshiping the porcelain throne or sick in bed or any of those things.
And some of them bacteria, especially it would kill you.
Right. Yeah. There were lots of things that people have died from pork festival meals because they weren't cooked enough. Turkey, right? People die from turkey not being cooked well. And turkey's a perfectly acceptable bird, but you got to cook the little beast. And people come up to me now and they'll say, well, we don't sacrifice anymore. It's like, yeah, we do, only we wrap it in plastic and put it in Publix. Last I checked, those animals were still slaughtered. and if they died naturally,
I think
I don't really want them.
They put distance, though, between the thought that,
Yeah.
that package of food that they're picking up at the store actually did walk around.
Yes, it did. It was fuzzy. It was cute. It nuzzled its mother. Its mother nuzzled it back, and then it was separated and slaughtered. We tend to forget that, and I think that in the ancient days, people were a lot closer to their food. Right? Some farmers still are. But in those days, you basically walked your dinner to the temple. Right? The sacrifice was not just burned up. It was roasted, and right, the priest ate the right shoulder. Why the right shoulder? Because it's the biggest part of the animal. And it's tender and all of those good things. And, maybe not tender, but it's got a good chunk of beef or
So you're
chicken.
saying that was like the primo cut?
It was the primo
Okay.
cut. Yeah, it was absolutely the
Yeah.
primo cut. And so you gave it to the priest and his family,
Mm-hmm.
and they ate it. It was their fee for slaughtering and butchering, right? Because part of what they did is to butcher and dress it and give it back to you. And so you ate part of it there, and then you had 3 days, because we didn't have refrigeration back then either. Dealing with that, refrigeration is an amazingly recent
Mm-hmm.
invention, and just like I am sure that the kids that are coming up today will just not understand why Moses didn't text or ask Siri for directions, because people tend to look at what they've got as if it had always been, and we didn't have all these conveniences.
Well, even in the beginning when you had, people had turn of the century, early 1900s ice boxes
Where
they had to fetch ice and had a tray underneath it to catch the water. How can, our children born today are
have
not
no clue.
going to even...
They won't even recognize a butter churn if they see one. Right?
Yeah.
They won't know what to do with it. And the idea of cream off the top of a milk bottle delivered by a milkman, that in the old days you left your back door open so the milkman could come in. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I can remember living as a preteen, but not by much, because it was pretty close to, it was where I celebrated my bat mitzvah, so I'm 12, 13 years old. And the back door of the house we left open. The milk container that the milkman put the milk in was in the kitchen. And he was a particularly good milkman. He put one jug of the milk in the fridge, and the others were in the milk box. And, you got milk and eggs and butter and all the things that the milkman brought. And that was actually one of my first experiences with what is called a Shabbos goy, right, which is the non-Jew who does things on Shabbat. And what he did, we came out Saturday morning, and the coffee was brewing, because he knew that it was a rabbi's house and that my mother wouldn't make coffee.
Mm-hmm.
So he went into her cabinet and got the coffee, in the old percolator.
Right.
And set up the coffee and plugged it in, and we woke up to the smell of coffee, and my mother's like, it didn't bother her that we had a milkman coming on Saturday, because you don't stop somebody on their routine. You don't pay for it on Saturday. So that was perfectly fine. But yeah, that was quite and the whole time we lived in that house, which is either 1 or 2 years, I can't remember exactly. But he always made coffee on Saturday morning, so we always had coffee on Shabbos morning, which was nice. And that was the purest form of it. My mother never told him to do it, never said anything to him other than thank you. But yeah, so those are memories drawn by when I was in Israel. I spent a year in Israel, and when I first started the year, we had a milkman delivering milk, and he actually stopped delivering. He was one of the last ones, and one day he knocks on the door and he says, "This is my last week. You're going to have to go to the store to buy milk from now on." Mm-hmm. So that was also a little bit of a culture shock, because we bought milk in plastic bags. You bought a sack of milk.
Okay.
Right. And you had a little container that held the plastic bag, and you snipped the tip of the bag.
Mm-hmm.
And, right. So, different culture, different things.
And everything old is new again, because, now look at Grubhub.
Yeah.
They'll bring food to you.
Yeah.
I think you can get groceries delivered.
Yes, you do. Oh, definitely. There's many ways to get groceries
And recently
delivered.
I heard it's this big new thing where doctors will come see you at your house.
Wow.
big new thing.
Yeah. House calls. Imagine
I think
that.
they did that a long time ago.
I think
yeah.
they did.
Yeah.
Well, and you can even get your dog groomed in your driveway.
Yeah.
Right. So, you're right. Everything goes around, comes
Yeah.
around, and recycles, and every generation thinks they're doing it all entirely new.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they also think that what they're doing has always been done. So we carry those interesting little sidebars against each other. So, back to a summary, because we're like 4 minutes, right? 4 minutes left to the show. If you've got a last question for me, please do give me a call at 772-340-1590 as we wrap up this edition of Ask a Rabbi on Digital 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast. So please do join me. And so let's real quickly back to scriptures. All right. There's an interesting piece in here. Right, 3 times a year you shall hold a festival for me, the festival of unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days, which of course is how long it is in Israel. It's 8 days usually here in the U.S. or anywhere else outside of Israel. And it says that you do that in the month of Aviv, the month of the barley sprout. And I doubt that anybody who doesn't know something about scriptures will recognize the month of Aviv, because we call that month Nisan now. We picked up the names of the months that are used on the Jewish calendar in Babylon. Lots of things changed during the Babylonian exile. We picked up some structural, excuse me, and an alphabet. Here we go. So, and I don't know too many people who can make it to Jerusalem 3 times a year, but there's no temple there anyway to appear at. So instead, we slaughter our animals here. And, what can I say? Lots of different things. And different Jews understand these scriptures differently. That's the other side. And it continues on after there from Mishpatim, going into some of the other rules and looking at it and seeing what it really means. And the people have an answer for what God has said, and that is Na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do it, and then we'll start to understand it, which is an interesting piece, right? So Judaism's not based on believing something as much as it is on how you behave. Yeah. Does what you do help make the world a little bit better than what you found it? Now, the exact words tikkun olam don't show up until it's used in Talmud, and it may have a slightly different meaning there than the way it's understood today. There it's, for example, some rules about divorce. Talmud spends a lot of time on divorce because scriptures just says, they cut a divorce and off they went, right? Hagar is shipped off with a jug and her kid. Is that a divorce? Of course, Islam says no. It was that Abraham was setting up 2 households, one for Sarah and one for Hagar. Those are all interesting things. I don't know. We weren't there. And with that, we'll close the little discussion on Mishpatim, or interpretations and judgments. This is Rabbi Shafir Lobb for Ask a Rabbi. Thank you for listening in, and thank you for calling.
This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.